In a video my aunt posted with my parents, I found out they call me an ungrateful freeloader, even though I covered their comfortable living. I immediately went no contact and stopped all financial help. I found out my parents thought of me as some ungrateful leech because my aunt put up a video of them online, even though I was the one paying for the life they enjoyed, and that moment pushed me to cut them off completely and shut down the flow of money for good. The video hit my phone at exactly 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday, while I was stretched out in bed after grinding through yet another brutal 16-hour workday, half asleep and doom-scrolling through social media until I could finally pass out. My Aunt Carol had uploaded it to her public Facebook page. A messy 20-minute ramble filmed in what was clearly my parents' living room. I almost skipped right past it without a second thought, and I probably would have if something hadn't stopped me at the last second. Maybe it was the thumbnail of my mom caught mid-laugh. Or maybe it was just bad luck lining everything up perfectly, but whatever it was, I hit play. At first it was painfully dull, just boring family small talk, with Carol mentioning she was visiting from Arizona and acting like she was some kind of low-budget documentary filmmaker recording the whole trip. My parents were sitting on the cream-colored leather sectional I had bought them 2 years earlier, sipping coffee made from the expensive Italian espresso machine I'd given them for Christmas, and nothing about it seemed unusual until the tone shifted. "I don't get young people anymore," Carol said from behind the camera. "They're all so entitled these days." My mom, Linda, nodded along eagerly and said, "You're telling me we raised our son to be independent and gave him everything, and now he acts like we owe him something." I straightened up in bed, my heart starting to slam against my chest as my dad, Frank, jumped in and said the kid basically lives rent-free and hasn't put a single dollar into this house in years, just takes and takes without giving anything back. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone as Carol responded in this overly sympathetic tone, saying how hard that must be for them after all they'd done for me. "It is hard," my mom said calmly as she took a careful sip from her mug. "We've tried to teach him gratitude and responsibility, but at this point he's just a freeloader, and your father and I work so hard to keep this lifestyle going while he contributes nothing." I had to pause the video because my vision went fuzzy, and it took a second to realize I was crying not from sadness, but from pure focused anger that felt sharp and cold. Before I go any further, you need the full context, and while my name isn't important here, my bank account definitely is. I'm 32 years old, and for the last 8 years I've been fully supporting my parents financially, not helping out here and there, not pitching in sometimes, but covering everything completely and without exception. It all started when I was 24 and had just scored my first big promotion at a tech startup where I worked as a software engineer. Right as the company was gearing up to go public and my stock options were starting to look like real money. Around that same time, my dad got laid off from his middle management job at a manufacturing plant, and at 58 years old he couldn't find anything even close to what he'd had before. My mom had never worked outside the house, having been a homemaker her whole life, which was fine, but it meant their income dropped to zero overnight and they were suddenly staring down foreclosure on their modest 3-bedroom home. I still remember the panic in my dad's voice the first time he called me, sounding defeated and scared in a way I'd never heard before, because he was always the strong one, the provider, the guy who had a plan. So I stepped in and paid off their mortgage in full using my signing bonus and my first stock sale, wiping out $340,000 in a blink, because they were my parents and they needed help, and that's what family is supposed to do. After that came everything else: the property taxes, utilities, car payments, medical bills their lousy insurance wouldn't cover, home repairs, groceries, clothes, entertainment, literally every expense you can think of. I told them it was just temporary, that it would hold them over until Dad found another job or they sorted out retirement, and they thanked me endlessly, with Mom crying and calling me her angel and Dad hugging me and saying I was the best son anyone could ask for. Then 2 years passed, then 3, and my dad stopped job hunting altogether because there was no reason to when I was paying for everything, while my mom started redecorating the house, upgrading appliances, and diving into pricey hobbies like oil painting and gourmet cooking. I tried to bring it up carefully, asking Dad if he'd thought about part-time work just to stay busy, but he brushed me off and said nobody hires a 60-year-old and that he'd earned the right to relax. Meanwhile, I was running myself into the ground, climbing from senior engineer to team lead to engineering director, taking on more hours, more stress, and more responsibility, all so I could afford the lifestyle my parents were growing accustomed to, from the cream leather couch and espresso machine to granite countertops, landscaping services, a house cleaner twice a week, premium cable with every sports channel, a country club membership, and weekend trips to wine country. Every month I sent them money starting at $3,000, then $5,000, then $8,000, and by the time Carol posted that video I was transferring $12,000 a month, not even counting the constant emergencies like a dental crown for mom, new tires for the car I bought them, fence repairs, or a brand new HVAC system. I lived alone in a small one-bedroom apartment that cost me $2,000 a month, drove a 7-year-old Honda, bought my clothes at Target, and hadn't taken a real vacation in 4 years, all while telling myself their happiness was worth it. Lying there in bed close to 3 in the morning, listening to my own mother call me an ungrateful freeloader, something inside me cracked and hardened into something colder, and I forced myself to finish the entire 20-minute video, including the part where Carol asked about their finances and Mom spun a detailed lie about them barely scraping by on a small pension and modest Social Security. None of that was true, not even close, because Frank hadn't worked nearly long enough to earn any real pension, having only spent about 12 years at that job before getting laid off. He was 66 now, but since he stopped working at 58, his Social Security record was thin, and when he filed early at 62 after 8 years of zero contributions, his monthly check barely covered groceries on a good month. The reality was simple and ugly. Without my money, they had nothing, yet they were telling the rest of the family that I was some kind of burden dragging them down. Frank went on and on about me supposedly living rent-free in their house, even though I hadn't lived under their roof since I graduated college 14 years ago. He complained about me eating their food and running up their utilities, which was laughable considering I visited maybe 4 times a year and always showed up with expensive gifts, full grocery runs, and usually paid for meals out. Linda then brought up how they had paid for my college education and how I'd apparently never even thanked them, when in reality they had contributed exactly $8,000 from a small savings account they'd started when I was born, while I covered the remaining $72,000 through scholarships, grants, and student loans that I'd finished paying off 3 years earlier. The lies just kept stacking up on top of each other, with them calling me difficult, selfish, and disrespectful of all the sacrifices they claimed to have made for me, and Linda even said I'd never amounted to much professionally, brushing off my career as just some computer job that barely paid the bills. Carol soaked it all in, nodding along and offering sympathy and validation every step of the way. And I watched until the very end, until she finally shut off the camera with some comment about how ungrateful kids are these days. After that, I sat alone in the dark and made a decision. First, I took screenshots of everything, the video itself and the comments underneath it, where several family members had already piled on with their own criticism. I downloaded the video file before Carol could think to make it private. Then I logged into my bank account and canceled the automatic transfer that was scheduled to go out in 3 days. After that, I opened my email and started writing, and I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I spent 6 straight hours documenting every single thing, every payment over 8 years, every mortgage payoff, utility bill, car payment, insurance premium, property tax installment, grocery delivery, home repair, and medical bill, because I'd kept meticulous records the whole time. When I added it all up, the total came to just over $960,000, nearly $1 million spent supporting my parents in 8 years. I built a spreadsheet, attached bank statements, and put together a timeline comparing the dates of their freeloading accusations with the dates of my actual payments, along with screenshots of texts where they thanked me for money, asked for more, and promised to be more careful. By the time the sun came up, I had a 47-page document laying out the full financial reality between my parents and me, and I sent it to everyone: Carol, my Uncle David, my cousins Emily, Ryan, and Lucas, and every family member who had commented on or been tagged in that video. I even sent it to my parents' neighbors who showed up in their social media photos and to the country club where they were members. The subject line read, "The Truth About the Ungrateful Freeloader," and the email itself was short and direct, explaining that the attached documentation showed nearly $1 million in support over 8 years, included the video where they called me a freeloader, and that people could draw their own conclusions about who had actually been taking advantage of whom. I ended by stating that effective immediately, all financial support had ended, and I wished my parents well in their newly independent retirement. I hit send at 6:07 in the morning, then blocked my parents' phone numbers, email addresses, and every social media account they had. I called in sick to work and took my first personal day in 3 years because I honestly needed it. As my hands wouldn't stop shaking, my stomach was tied in knots, and I kept breaking down in tears out of nowhere. Around 10 that morning, calls started coming in from unknown numbers, and I ignored every single one as voicemails stacked up, with Carol crying and apologizing, Uncle David sounding angry and defensive, Linda hysterical and barely coherent, and Frank trying and failing to sound reasonable, all of which I deleted after listening to only a few seconds. Then came the emails full of backtracking and excuses, with Carol claiming she'd misunderstood everything, Linda insisting they'd been joking and I'd taken it out of context, and Frank suggesting I was having some kind of breakdown and needed help, while messages from my cousins ranged from apologetic to outright accusatory. Emily wrote a long email saying I was tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding. Ryan sent a short note calling me petty, and Lucas surprised me by saying he'd always felt something was off about my parents' story and was sorry he hadn't questioned it sooner. I didn't respond to a single one, and by the third day things escalated in a way I hadn't expected when Linda showed up at my apartment building. The doorman called to ask if I wanted to let her up, and I could hear her in the background, shrill and demanding, so I told him to say I wasn't home. He relayed that message politely, which only made her start screaming that she knew I was there, and that no one could keep her from her own son, forcing him to tell her she needed to leave or security would be called. The line went dead, and I stood by my door, half expecting her to somehow appear in the hallway, but she never did. About 20 minutes later, the doorman called back to confirm she'd left after causing enough of a scene to prompt complaints from other residents, and with my hands still trembling, I poured myself a glass of wine. It was barely 11 in the morning, but I honestly didn't care because the nerve it took for her to show up at my building, playing the victim and demanding access to me after what she'd said, was almost impressive in how shameless it was. Later that afternoon, I got another email from my cousin Emily, this one much longer and more thoughtful than her first message, and it was clear she'd actually gone through the documentation I sent and started asking questions. She wrote that she'd spoken to her mom about the timeline I laid out, and her mom confirmed that my parents, Linda and Frank, had been living pretty comfortably for years, and everyone had just assumed Frank had some kind of pension or investment income. Apparently her mom had even asked about it once, and Linda got defensive and changed the subject, which Emily said now made a lot more sense. She admitted the situation was more complicated than she'd realized, but also said the video made it sound like I was living with my parents and taking advantage of them, and that no one had known the truth because nobody had said anything. To me, the answer was painfully obvious. They could have asked, they could have questioned a story that made me the villain without proof, and they could have given me the benefit of the doubt after knowing me my entire life, but they didn't, and that told me exactly where I stood. On the fourth day, something unexpected happened when my boss, Kenneth Rothman, called me into his office, and my stomach dropped as I wondered if my parents had somehow reached my workplace. He told me to sit down and said he wanted to check in because calling in sick was unusual for me and I'd seemed distracted, then asked if everything was okay. I debated how much to share, since we had a solid but professional relationship and didn't usually talk about personal stuff, but something about his genuine concern made me decide to be honest. I told him I was dealing with a complicated family situation, that I'd discovered my parents had been seriously misrepresenting our relationship to extended family while I'd been financially supporting them for years, and that I'd cut them off and things had blown up. Kenneth leaned back and asked how long I'd been supporting them, and when I said 8 years and nearly $1 million, his eyebrows shot up and he said that explained a lot. When I asked what he meant, he pointed out that I'd turned down promotions that required relocation, cashed out stock options most people would have held, worked more hours than anyone else on the team, and avoided company perks like executive retreats or development opportunities that involve travel, and he'd always wondered why. Hearing it laid out like that hit me hard, and I admitted I'd needed the cash and stayed nearby because my parents claimed they needed me for emergencies, or at least that's what I believed at the time, and now I was realizing I'd put my entire life on hold for people who didn't appreciate it and actually resented me. Kenneth nodded and told me sincerely that I was one of the most talented engineers he'd worked with, and that if I ever wanted to revisit opportunities I'd passed on, his door was open, especially since a new initiative was launching in the spring that could use someone with my leadership skills and came with more responsibility, but also a lot more compensation and equity. That conversation flipped a switch in my head, because I'd been so focused on what I'd lost that I hadn't even thought about what I might gain. And I told him I wanted to hear more. He promised to send details, and as I walked back to my desk, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, real excitement about my future. That evening, my cousin Lucas called without any small talk and said I needed to know what was going on, explaining that Frank had tried to take out a loan using the house as collateral, but the bank found out the house was paid off and that they had zero income, so the loan was denied. I said good, and Lucas told me they were panicking, that Linda had called his mom crying and saying they were going to lose everything, and while his mom felt bad and offered to lend them money, His dad shut that down fast, saying that if their own child walked away after seeing the situation up close, the rest of the family should think very carefully before getting involved. I told Lucas his dad sounded like a smart man, and he said he was, and that he was also angry on my behalf and thought what Linda said in that video was unforgivable, and that I had every right to protect myself. Hearing that kind of support from someone I barely knew outside of holidays brought tears to my eyes, and I asked him to thank his dad for me. Lucas said he would, then added that Carol had taken the video down, but not before plenty of people downloaded or shared it, and now it was floating around family group chats with people taking sides. I asked what sides there even were when I had documentation, and he said I'd be surprised how many people thought I should forgive them just because they're my parents, including Frank's sister Helen, who sent a long message about honoring your parents, and even Emily's husband, who called me selfish for cutting off elderly people. At the same time, just as many family members thought I'd done the right thing, and the whole situation had turned into a full-blown family civil war. A week earlier, the idea of relatives I saw once a year arguing passionately about my life would have seemed ridiculous, but now it just felt exhausting, so I told him to let them argue because my decision wasn't changing. Over the following weeks, Lucas kept me updated, and I learned that my parents tried to get Frank's old job back or something similar, but the 8-year gap in his employment history was impossible to explain, and no one was interested. Linda's attempt to get a job at a grocery store was, by all accounts, deeply humiliating for her, at least according to what Lucas's mom heard through the family grapevine. She'd never written a resume in her life, never sat through a job interview, and at 63 years old she was completely unprepared for the modern workforce. For a brief moment I felt a flicker of sympathy, but then I remembered the video, remembered the way her voice dripped with contempt when she called me a freeloader, and that sympathy vanished just as fast. They were grown adults, they had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences of those choices. My mother made one final attempt to reach me, this time by sending a handwritten letter directly to my workplace, and to this day I still don't know how she got the address, though I strongly suspected Carol had helped despite all her apologies. The letter was 6 pages long, written on the expensive stationery I'd bought her for Mother's Day 3 years earlier, and it opened with pure guilt, asking how I could abandon them in their time of need and reminding me that they had raised me, fed me, clothed me, and sacrificed so much when I was young. Then came the excuses, with her claiming the video was taken out of context, that she'd been tired and stressed about money, that she hadn't really meant what she said, and that she was just agreeing with Carol, who had been complaining about her own kids. By the 3rd page, the tone flipped to anger, calling me cruel, heartless, and vindictive, accusing me of ruining their lives over one tiny mistake and asking what kind of son would do this to his own parents. Pages 4 and 5 swung back to guilt again, this time layered with religion, telling me I had a duty to honor my parents, that I was betraying everything they taught me about family loyalty, and that my grandmother would be rolling in her grave if she knew how I was behaving. The final page was pure desperation, warning that they were about to lose their home, couldn't afford their medications, and were facing poverty in old age, begging me to reconsider, promising they would do anything, even apologize publicly, if I would just not leave them destitute. I read the entire letter twice while sitting in my car in the office parking garage, then tore it into small pieces and threw it away. Sending it to my workplace, where it could have exposed my private family issues to colleagues, was just another manipulation, counting on my embarrassment and my desire to keep work and personal life separate to force a response, and it didn't work. That night I emailed my attorney, Fiona Bradshaw, a sharp and no-nonsense woman I'd already consulted after my parents' first threatening letter, forwarded her the handwritten note, and asked her to draft a cease and desist demanding no further contact at my home, my job, or through third parties, with a restraining order to follow if they ignored it. Fiona replied quickly, saying she'd have it ready by the next afternoon and adding that, for what it was worth, my mother's letter was a textbook example of manipulative abuse tactics, and that I should save it in case things escalated. The cease and desist was delivered 3 days later, and Lucas later told me it triggered another meltdown, with my mother accusing me of being dramatic and my father saying I'd gone too far, and that legal action meant there was no coming back. He was right about one thing: there was no coming back, but that had nothing to do with the letter because that door had slammed shut the moment I watched that video. Work became my safe place after that, especially the new initiative Kenneth had mentioned, which turned out to be a full restructuring of our product development pipeline and demanded everything I had. For 10 to 12 hours a day, I didn't think about my parents at all, losing myself in code architecture, team coordination, and long-term strategy, and my performance, which had always been strong, jumped to another level entirely. Without the constant anxiety of wondering how I'd pay for their next emergency, my focus sharpened, ideas came easier, and problems that once felt stuck suddenly had clear solutions, which Kenneth noticed when he told me to keep doing whatever I was doing because I'd been on fire for 2 straight months. What I was doing differently was finally living for myself after 8 years, and the difference was night and day. I also started saying yes to social things I'd always turned down before, like happy hours with coworkers, a weekend hiking trip through the company outdoor club, and a concert with my friend Melissa, who I'd slowly drifted away from because I never had the time or money. While we waited for the show to start, she told me it was good to have me back and admitted she'd been worried because I'd seemed so worn down, and I told her she was right, but things had changed, giving her the shortened version of the story. She was stunned, asking if my parents really said those things after everything I'd done for them, calling it insane, and when I told her I was done with them permanently, she shook her head and said, "Good for you, honestly, because a lot of people would have folded under that kind of family pressure." The pressure did exist, with distant relatives trying their own interventions, like my dad's cousin Bernard calling out of the blue to lecture me about family duty, and my mom's old friend Nancy sending a Facebook message about forgiveness and healing, but I either ignored them or replied briefly that my decision was final and not open for discussion. The people who knew the whole story supported me, and the ones who didn't but judged me anyway weren't people whose opinions mattered to me. 3 months after cutting contact, something clicked during a therapy session when Dr. Howard asked me to describe my relationship with my parents before I started supporting them financially, and I automatically said it was fine before stopping myself and admitting I wasn't sure that was true, because when he asked what I meant, I realized I'd always felt like I was trying to earn their approval. Nothing I ever did seemed to fully measure up in their eyes, because whenever I brought home a B in high school they wanted to know why it wasn't an A, and when I got into a solid college they focused on the better schools that hadn't accepted me instead. When I landed my first job, their reaction was muted, like they were quietly disappointed it wasn't at some bigger name company, and it wasn't until I started giving them money that something finally shifted. That was when they started sounding proud, when they began telling people about my success and bragging about how well I was doing, and for a long time I honestly believed I'd finally made them happy. Dr. Howard gave me that look then, the one she uses when she wants me to follow a thought all the way to the end, and suddenly it clicked. "Oh," I said softly, "they weren't proud of me, they were proud of what I could do for them," and realizing that hurt more than I expected. "Yeah," she said gently. I sat there for a second and then asked the question that had been forming in my head, wondering out loud if I was ever going to be enough for them unless I was useful, and based on everything I'd shared, she agreed that seemed to be the case. The grief that washed over me wasn't about losing the relationship I had. It was about mourning the relationship I'd never actually had, because I'd been chasing a fantasy version of parental love that never existed and never was going to. That session changed something fundamental in me, because the guilt that had been whispering in the back of my mind, questioning whether I was being too harsh, finally went quiet when I understood you can't be too harsh with boundaries when someone only values you for what you provide. From that point on, I started looking at my future differently, realizing I'd spent my entire 20s and early 30s in survival mode, working nonstop just to keep Linda and Frank afloat. Now at 32, I finally had the space to ask myself what I actually wanted, and the answers came fast. I wanted real travel, not rushed weekends, but places like Europe, Japan, and New Zealand, so I started planning a 2-week trip to Italy for the spring, something I'd never even considered when every dollar was spoken for. I wanted hobbies that cost money without feeling guilty, so I signed up for piano lessons with a highly recommended instructor, bought a decent camera, enrolled in a photography workshop, and joined a gym with good equipment that I actually used. I wanted to date without my family situation hanging over every conversation, and when I met Lucas at a mutual friend's barbecue, I realized I was ready for something real in a way I hadn't been before. Our first date was just coffee that somehow turned into a 4-hour conversation, the second was dinner and a movie, and by the 5th date, when I told him about my parents, I wasn't looking for validation or sympathy, just sharing my history with someone I was starting to care about. His response was perfect in its simplicity, telling me that it must have been really hard and that he was glad I got out of that situation without judgment, without questions, just acceptance. I also started reconnecting with people I'd lost touch with during the years I was supporting my parents, like my college roommate Vanessa, whom I hadn't seen in 6 years, and my former coworker Dante, who I drifted away from because I never had the time or money to keep up. They remembered a version of me that felt lighter and more present, and being around them reminded me who I used to be and showed me glimpses of who I could become again. Financially, the recovery was slower than I wanted but steadier than I'd feared. And I began maxing out my retirement contributions, setting up automatic investments, and building an emergency fund that was actually for my emergencies instead of someone else's. I met with a financial planner who helped me map out a 10-year plan for real wealth, and she told me I was in a better position than I thought, that while I was behind where I could have been, my income was strong, my expenses were low now, and I had time on my side and I'd be fine. Fine felt like too small a word for what I was experiencing because I wasn't just fine, I was free. I also reached out to a therapist, and while the first session was awkward and emotional, Cassandra Howard turned out to be exactly what I needed, helping me understand I'd been stuck in a cycle of manipulation and obligation that my parents had built by exploiting my love and sense of duty. During our third session, she said they trained you to be their safety net and then resented you for it because it reminded them of their own failures, and while that insight hurt, it also set me free. About 3 weeks after I cut off contact, a letter arrived from a law firm claiming my parents intended to sue me for elder abuse and financial exploitation, accusing me of promising lifetime support, saying they'd made decisions based on that promise, and arguing that cutting them off amounted to abandonment. And I actually laughed out loud when I read it, a sharp, slightly unhinged sound that startled my cat. I called the attorney listed on the letter, a man named Jonathan Pierce, and when he answered sounding young and unsure, I introduced myself as the so-called ungrateful freeloader his clients accused of exploiting them and told him I'd like to send some documentation before he went any further. I sent everything: the spreadsheets, bank statements, the video, the timeline, the texts where Linda and Frank asked for money, the emails where they thanked me for it, and the records showing they had no income of their own. 3 days later, I received another letter from Mr. Pierce, short and to the point, informing me that his firm was withdrawing from representing Linda and Frank due to irreconcilable differences regarding the facts of the case. Reading between the lines of that letter, it was obvious the attorney had finally realized my parents had lied to him from the start, and I won't pretend I didn't feel a dark sense of satisfaction about that. Over time, the phone calls stopped coming, the emails slowed to a trickle, and eventually my family, such as it was, fell completely silent. Through Lucas, who had quietly become my only remaining link to that side of the family, I learned that Linda and Frank were in real trouble. The house I'd paid off was technically theirs outright, but they couldn't afford the property taxes on it, which were high because of all the upgrades I'd funded, and they also couldn't keep up with utilities or basic maintenance. They tried to sell the house, but the market was soft, and on top of that they still owed money on the cars I'd bought them. Frank had applied for Social Security, but since he stopped working at 58, his benefit was barely anything, and Linda had never worked long enough to qualify for her own. They were staring down food stamps and Medicaid. Lucas asked me if I felt bad about any of it, and I had to sit with that question for a long time before answering honestly. No, I finally said, I don't. They made choices, they chose to stop working, they chose to live beyond their means, they chose to lie about me to everyone we know, and they chose to call me a freeloader while spending my money. These are the consequences of those choices. That sounds harsh, Lucas said, though he didn't sound judgmental, more thoughtful. Maybe, I replied, but you know what's actually harsh? Working yourself sick for years to support people who secretly despise you. That's harsh, and he didn't argue with that. About 6 months after I cut them off, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and by then I'd started answering unknown calls again, assuming the worst of it was over. It turned out to be a county social worker who told me my parents had applied for emergency assistance and had listed me as their son, and she wanted to ask about my ability and willingness to provide financial support. I told her plainly that I'd supported them fully for 8 years, given them nearly $1 million, and that they had publicly claimed I was a freeloader who contributed nothing, adding that I had extensive documentation if she needed it and that I would not be providing any further support. She went quiet for a moment, then asked me to send the documentation, which I did, and I never heard from her again. Later, Lucas told me my parents were approved for various assistance programs and were just barely getting by. They sold the house at a loss and moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment in a rougher part of town, sold one of their cars, Linda picked up a part-time job at a grocery store, and Frank started doing odd jobs through a senior employment program. In other words, they were finally living the life they should have been living all along instead of the fantasy retirement I'd bankrolled. About a year after everything blew up, I ran into Carol at a restaurant while I was out with coworkers celebrating a successful project launch. She was alone waiting for a takeout order, and when our eyes met across the room, I barely recognized her, older, more worn down, guilt etched all over her face. She approached my table cautiously and asked if we could talk, so I stepped outside with her. She apologized right away, saying she hadn't known about the money and that my parents had lied to her too, and I told her flatly that she'd posted that video publicly without verifying a single thing and had chosen to believe the worst about me and broadcast it to everyone. She admitted she'd been wrong and said she'd told Linda and Frank she wouldn't be visiting them anymore because she couldn't condone what they'd done. I looked at her closely, and while the apology seemed sincere, I felt absolutely nothing, no anger, no relief, no forgiveness, just a hollow emptiness where our relationship used to be. I told her I appreciated her saying that, but I didn't see any reason for us to stay in touch, and that there really wasn't anything left to say between us. She tried one last time, saying my mother missed me, and I reminded her calmly that my mother had called me a freeloader while drinking coffee I paid for, sitting on furniture I bought, in a house I saved from foreclosure, and that she was free to miss me all she wanted because that was no longer my problem. Carol nodded, accepted it, and walked away, and I went back inside, laughed at a coworker's joke, and the moment passed as if it had never happened. These days my life looks completely different. I still work hard, but now I'm working for myself instead of propping up someone else's fantasy. My retirement accounts are strong and growing, and last month I bought my first house, nothing flashy, but it's mine, fully and completely mine. I'm dating someone now, a guy named Lucas who works in the medical field, and when I told him about my parents on our 5th date, bracing for judgment, he just pulled me close and said I did what I had to do and anyone who disagreed didn't understand. I sleep better now, because the anxiety that used to wake me up at 3 in the morning worrying about my parents' latest crisis is gone. I have hobbies again, hiking, photography, piano, reading for enjoyment instead of collapse. Lucas still sends occasional updates, saying my parents are struggling but surviving, and that they've never apologized, instead spinning a new story where I'm the villain who abandoned them. A story some relatives believe and others quietly question to keep the peace. I genuinely don't care anymore, because that entire side of the family could disappear tomorrow, and my life would go on unchanged. Dear Howard says I'm doing remarkably well, that the grief I felt over losing my parents, even parents who never truly valued me, was real and valid, but that I've worked through it and accepted the truth, which is that the parents I exhausted myself trying to please never really existed. They were a fantasy I clung to, while the Rayal, Linda and Frank were people who saw their son as a resource to exploit, felt no gratitude for the life I gave them, and found it easier to paint me as a burden than to face their own failures. Walking away from them was the smartest and healthiest choice I've ever made. And I don't hesitate when people ask if I'll ever reconcile, because the answer is simply no. There's nothing left to fix, no relationship to rebuild, because you can't repair something that was never real in the first place, and you can't patch over damage that runs this deep and this basic. They showed me exactly who they were, and for the first time in my life I actually believed them. The money is gone, and I've made peace with that, choosing to see it as tuition for a hard-earned education about boundaries, manipulation, and self-respect. It was an incredibly expensive lesson, sure, but some lessons are worth every dollar when they save the rest of your life. I have a family now, even if it doesn't look like the one I was born into, made up of friends who show up when it matters, coworkers who respect and value what I bring to the table, Lucas who treats me like a true partner instead of an ATM, a therapist who helps me untangle trust and self-worth, and Timothy, the one blood relative who chose honesty over convenience. That's enough, and honestly, it's more than enough. My money, my time, my energy, my love, all of it belongs to me now, and I get to decide where it goes, and I choose to give it to people who deserve it, who appreciate it, and who would never even think of calling me a freeloader while spending money I earned through 16-hour days and years of sacrifice. The video Denise posted is still out there somewhere in the endless digital junk drawer of the internet, but I've never gone looking for it, and I don't need to, because I already know what it showed me, what it taught me, and what it finally freed me from. In a strange way, I'm grateful she posted it, because if she hadn't, I might have kept playing along for years, grinding myself down trying to please two people who were never going to be satisfied. I might have worked myself into an early grave chasing approval that was never coming, and I might never have learned what it feels like to live for yourself instead of for people who only love what you provide. So here's to so-called ungrateful freeloaders, and to finding the courage to stop apologizing for existing, to expect the respect we deserve, and to walk away from anyone who refuses to give it, even when it's family, especially when it's family. Because in the end, being alone is better than being used, and being free is far better than being needed by people who don't actually love you at all.